Welcome to another episode of Power the Network. I'm your host, Tim Locker, Vice President of Broadband here at CBM. One of the things I love about doing this podcast is being able to meet new people. And today we've got a special guest, Jade Piros de Carvalho. She is the Director for the State of Kansas Office of Broadband. We've got a great conversation today. It was a great opportunity for me to finally meet her. And let's not waste any more time and get into our conversation. Jade, thank you so much for being here today. It's a pleasure to get to meet you finally, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. Tell me a little bit, how did you get into broadband?
Yeah, well, thanks, Tim, for having me. I always love hearing these stories, too, about how people fell into this industry because it's not often an intentional choice to go into broadband. And much of my career was in the marketing and kind of public relations space. But in one of those roles as a marketer, I was working for my local Chamber of Commerce and Economic Development organization. On the board of directors for that organization was a young man who owned a rural fiber CLEC. And so we just got to know each other, had a mutual respect because of, similar work ethics, similar values. And then I was recruited away from that role to run a marketing company for a consortium of Kansas-owned newspapers. So kind of lost touch with him. He pivoted the company from being a fiber to the home business to a fiber to the tower business, built a couple thousand miles of fiber across Kansas, and then ended up selling that company and then retooling it with the scraps and wanted to, he invited me on to do the marketing and sales for that company. So the idea was to return back to the company's original roots, which was bringing fiber broadband to underinvested, really, really rural, small communities. We're talking a couple hundred people. And I knew nothing about broadband, right? This is around the 2015 timeframe. And that's where I really cut my teeth and was able to join the company. It was about 15 people, do a little bit of everything. So it's kind of how I fell into it and just really love it. It's not the most exciting topic to a lot of people, but there's a lot of different directions you can go in this industry, from engineering, marketing, sales.
Oh, yeah.
It's great.
It's really a small industry. Over the years, I've been doing this for, going on 30 years now, but in different roles. But yeah, you see the same faces. They may be wearing a different shirt from time to time, but it's really a tight-knit group of folks for sure.
Yeah, and all of them are really friendly and helpful. So it's been good.
So in, we sell mostly outside plant products.
Yeah.
We do some DC power work and et cetera. But as a sales guy calling on an independent telco, for example, we're really focused on that side of the outside plant construction, et cetera. From a marketing standpoint, what are we missing as salespeople? How can we help the companies that we're, trying to market to differently and not just think solely on outside plant? Is there something we can do, along the marketing lines that we can help these companies differently? That's
a great question. I will say with the company that I was with was quite small and going into markets that were really difficult to make the economics work, right?
Sure.
Very sparsely populated areas. And it's really about what can your product do to make the business case more feasible, right? And really marketing the way that you can bring efficiencies to the table. A big part of my job, even though I was in the marketing space, was the stakeholder engagement and partnership coordination, because you really had to leverage partnerships and resources to make things happen that wouldn't necessarily work, such as, how can you talk with a co-op and do a pole attachment agreement at a less expensive rate?
Sure.
How could you, get some sort of right-of-way concessions from county leadership along dirt roads to make it easier? So I really think highlighting the way that your products bring cost efficiencies is not maybe the sexiest message, but you look at Bead and this or the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Act that state broadband offices are administering, and those dollars are going into spaces that there's a reason that there's not broadband there, right? It's because it's never been economically feasible, and so the biggest scoring component of winning a grant with these funds is something called minimal bead outlay. And you're going to find this across all 56 states and territories. Even though everyone's going to have a different scoring rubric, the biggest component in that scoring for any subgrant is how are you asking for the least amount of government funding to deploy that network. And so bringing products to the table that help lower that bead outlay is going to put applicants at a competitive advantage.
Sure. Well, that brings up another topic when I think about that. So one of my concerns with, all of the funding that we're putting towards the broadband is how do we make these networks last?
Yeah.
We've already seen some projects even having to be rebuilt, in 10, 12 years, et cetera. And this money's not going to last forever.
Yeah.
And we talk about having to do things, future-proof the network, et cetera. But how do we maintain that philosophy, but then still go down the how do we do it as cheap as possible?
Yeah,
path?
No, it's a great question. How do you balance that? But I think you bring up a good point, and it's what I've referred to oftentimes as the buy cheap, buy twice mentality.
Yeah.
That we've really utilized through all previous efforts to bridge the digital divide. You have these reverse auctions with the lowest bidder coming in, but then there's not really proper vetting on the front side to ensure the financial, technical, and managerial capability to do the project, and there's no compliance on the back side to ensure that the taxpayer got their dollars worth and that commitments or obligations were made under those agreements. So a lot of these decisions on future-proofing and building sustainable networks that last were made at the federal level in the legislation when fiber was chosen as the prioritized technology for grant winners. And so to the extent possible, every state is being encouraged to deploy as much fiber as they can. Now, we know that the formula for allocating these BEAD dollars wasn't perfect, and some states got a lot more than they needed. Some states have a big shortfall. And so Kansas, for instance, we estimate with our cost modeling that we'll be able to deliver about 75% of networks fiber. Mm-hmm. And then we'll be looking at fixed wireless for the other 25%. But I think even within these alternative technologies, there's a lot of exciting innovation happening, and there needs to be an eye for the more innovative and longer lasting technologies within that bucket.
Yeah.
Right. So even with fiber, are you going to use GPON or XGS-PON? Within wireless, are you going to use equipment that is going to be backwards compatible as it's upgraded, at the tower?
Yeah.
Or are you going to have to do a complete rip and replace every couple years, which is what we've been funding, right, with a lot of government grants.
And I was going to ask that too, in terms of future proofing. What do you think plays more into that role? The actual fiber itself, the outside plant components, or the electronics that we're utilizing?
It's a good question, and I'm not a network engineer. I'm a marketer and a policy person. But I would say that if you build the network really sustainable and resilient with good duct and strong components, that the electronics can be switched out every 10 years as we have greater bandwidth needs. There are other, I think, components of the network that are being glossed over from a future-proofing standpoint with Bead, such as, latency. I think the latency requirements on these networks under the legislation are only like sub 100 milliseconds. So we know that, some of the technology coming out today is going to need, sub 30, sub 8 milliseconds. Sure. But I think we can't boil the ocean with this program, but we're going to do our darndest to ensure that the dollars are spent in a way that doesn't leave people out of luck in 7-10 years like a lot of these programs have.
Yeah. No, that's great. Kansas, my old territory was Iowa, Nebraska, and I think Nebraska and Kansas have a lot of similarities, especially, the further west you go, obviously you've got a lot smaller population. Yeah. And some of my customers out there, they were forced, years ago to do fiber to the home in the rural, before the cities, because they could maintain the speeds they needed, still on copper in town, but when you've got a ranch that's 40 miles away, there's no other way to take care of it. So I'm sure you're dealing with the same thing out there.
Yeah, and I think you'll see that a lot in Kansas, that you'll go into these really rural spaces and they'll be 100% fiber to the prem. And then some of the cities, like for instance, I'm from Hutchinson. We were a community of 40,000. I now live in the northeast part of the state, but we didn't have fiber to the home, in Hutchinson. But in all the small communities in Reno County, many of them, Yoder, Kansas, population like 100, they had fiber.
Yeah.
Well,
I live in a small town in Iowa, Slater. Huxley Communications built fiber to the home in that town. I don't remember the exact year, but early 2000s, 2001, 2002.
Yeah.
And so I've had it, as long as I can remember. We've been spoiled. Now, there's been a lot of things changed in, 20 plus years. They don't construct it and do it the same, as they did back then. But
a lot of it was direct buried, which, we, kind of shoot ourselves now for that. But
why do you say that?
Well, it's instead of putting in
instead of putting in duct.
But it's still, pretty well maintained depending on the depths. And but yeah, we have a lot of rural ILECs that are 100% fiber in all of their exchanges and have been for the better part of a decade or more. So it's really incredible.
So what does the Bead funding do for a company like that that's built out? Are they looking at just areas to expand?
Yeah.
Or how do we manage that and maintain a good business model if you're, all of a sudden build a network that's 100 miles away? Or,
yeah.
You see where I'm going?
Yeah, good question. So a lot of these rural ILECs also have a CLEC, right? And so their exchange might be 100% fiber. Or maybe they haven't quite gotten to that. We've got some that still have a lot of DSL in their exchanges. So Bead will definitely be an opportunity for them because we did what is called DSL pre-modifications in our initial proposal, which basically designates any DSL location as underserved and Bead eligible.
Okay.
So exchanges or ILECs that, still have a lot of copper in their networks will be able to bid to bring those up to fiber. But a lot of rural ILECs that I've spoken with are really looking at this as an opportunity to edge out their networks through CLECs and really get to areas outside of their exchange that, we still have a lot of locations that have, they're on GEO. They don't even have LEO satellite, right? And so how do we get to them if they're, a full mile away from plant?
Yeah.
So I think it'll be an interesting dilemma trying to get to those onesies and twosies, especially considering that a lot of our grant programs through the FCC and even USDA created the pockets that make it more difficult. They gave grants for the population centers, which really made getting to those last 5 to 10% even more difficult, really.
Yeah, let's face it. If there's not enough customers to make it pay, that's how we got in this, into the first place. The big boys aren't interested in putting 3 miles of fiber in to go to one farm. It doesn't make sense. No, so I think we all know, how we got into this, and why the areas are underserved, and being from a small town or small communities, especially in the rural, a lot of farmers, rural people, small communities. Sometimes they feel kind of left out or, not counted for. And I think COVID probably had a big turn on this, obviously, as people are moving and working from home. But, talk a little bit about why broadband for everybody is really so important.
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and it's why I really enjoy this job, because I feel like it's mission-based, and I get to come in every day with this goal in mind, and that is to connect every Kansan. And I see broadband as an opportunity equalizer, right? There's a lot that goes into, the success of an individual or a household or a business, but so it's more than broadband. But broadband is certainly such a vital component of quality of life and opportunity for people to fully participate in society, really. You can't do a whole lot without a broadband connection. You can't, apply for government services or a job, you can't, take part in telehealth or education opportunities the same way. You can't work remotely. And I can remember I, in my former job, had moved more into the policy kind of broadband expansion advocacy space, government relations, and I would talk to lawmakers about the critical nature of this service and how it was part and parcel with like our everyday lives. And I would get comments. I remember a congressman telling me, "Well, that's like building a paved road when a dirt road would do. If people want Netflix, they can move into town." And you try to bring in all this data around the homework gap, in households with school-age kids with broadband and without. But there just wasn't a lot of data to really prove the point. And then the pandemic hits.
Yep.
And it's like I could just skip over 75% of my spiel because I didn't need to spend so much energy convincing people that it wasn't this nice to have amenity, but that it was like, an everyday utility. And we could just talk about solutions and how we're going to get it into people's hands. And then now there's money to do that. And so not only am I in this position to help, facilitate these connections, but there's money to do so. And so I think it's a really interesting time in the history of our country where we all have this recognition that, connecting every home and business is, this common goal and something that the kind of bare minimum we have to do as a country. And there's money to get it done. So it's really exciting.
Yeah, that's a great opportunity for you to, you're just like, see, I told you. Look what happened.
I tried not to say I told you so, but it was interesting how attitudes and the general zeitgeist of lawmakers changed after the pandemic. Pandemic made it really, really clear and exacerbated those inequities, quite frankly, especially between rural and urban areas. Kids just...
Yeah, where certain people were able to go and work from home and other people were just lost their jobs.
Exactly.
So it definitely had different impacts.
And it definitely had different impacts for women, too. It took a lot of women out of the workforce because of that access to broadband. I was speaking with... we have our largest rural ILEC in Kansas has some customers that are way out from their fiber line, and they're serving them with a really quality wireless product. But I was talking to the woman who homeschools all 4 of her kids and has a full-time remote job that she's able to do because of that connection, and couldn't do it, quite frankly, during the pandemic because she was unable to work because she didn't have broadband connection. So it definitely is making an impact on the workforce and on individuals, opportunities. Yeah, for sure.
No, that's great. So if you get anything out of this episode, just remember that we work in several different markets. We've got expertise in many areas. And if we don't, we've got the relationships to find the answers that are right for you. We go really deep with our relationships, and that's really what we value here at CBM. If we can be of service to you, please reach out, cbmrep.com. Talk a little bit about your Broadband Ready Community program.
Yeah.
I'm a little interested in that. Like, what does that actually do? Do you, tell me how it works. You're going out and visiting with, mayors, city councils, et cetera, just selling why they need to upgrade their broadband, or what's the spiel?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked about this because I feel like it's such a full circle moment because I when I was on the private side, I was trying to convince our broadband office to introduce a program like this, but they were so small and just didn't have any capacity to do so. But this is something that has been successfully done in states like Indiana and Tennessee and Georgia for the last few years. And it's really just a tool to educate local government about how to make their communities more friendly to broadband investment by lowering just the simplest barriers. So it doesn't require, it's not a big ask. One single point of contact for broadband deployment projects at the city, reviewing any kind of permit or application within 30 days, moving to online applications if you don't have electronic filing of permits, and then not charging unreasonable fees for these permits. And then the last thing is just operating in a non-discriminatory manner. So allowing anybody to use your right-of-way, not discriminating. And now this is all in a state statute, but it's just not really, people
Not
don't really
top of
know
mind.
about it.
Yeah.
People don't really know about it, and it's not really enforced if you're not doing it. So if there are communities out there that might be using, say, permitting fees as a revenue stream, when you're really precluded from charging fees that are greater than the administrative costs of issuing the permits, right? And so we're working with our Association of Counties and League of Kansas Municipalities, and also going out to communities during regional planning. So we've identified about 12 regions that have a lot of Bead eligible locations, and we're trying to convene all the stakeholders and have a really community-driven conversation about designing a network that works for them. And that's when we, really start to get into what are you doing on your side to bring something to the table. I can remember pre-pandemic talking to one county, and there was this group of people who really wanted broadband out in this rural area. So we used to operate in tiny towns, but even tiny towns are huge compared to these exurbs or whatever you want to call them, where there's onesies and twosies across a country road, and you'd get a group of broadband champions that would just knock down your door, for, you've got to bring us broadband. And we'd run a typical business case. Oh, wow, that's never going to happen. Okay, well then how can we be creative? Can we do this? And I remember there was one community where we thought, if we can just talk the county commissioners into letting us bury along the edge of the road instead of in the ditch, we can make it work, right? You would have thought we were asking for their firstborn, man. Like, that was not going to happen. But this was pre-pandemic, right? Well, it's post-pandemic now, and they're going to be a broadband ready community. They're 100% on board. And so really it's just about educating policymakers that there's a reason why there isn't broadband in these spaces, and it's because it's very difficult, and what can they bring to the table to help make it more feasible.
Yeah, really, it doesn't make any sense at all for a city or municipal to make it difficult, frankly, because it's going to better their town. People in general, they want to live, they know the need for broadband, and they're going to live in a place where they have it.
Well, I agree, but I also think it's lost on providers sometimes that in these rural communities, especially, municipalities, you may have one part-time clerk. And that's it. And that person is.
And they might be working for a couple of cities, sharing the role.
Exactly. Yeah. And so there's just not a lot of capacity. And so we try at the broadband office to be that liaison and also a resource and helping get these ideas off the ground and facilitating those partnerships. So really educating both sides as to what are the struggles each are going through, and how can we work together to get this done.
Now, you were mayor of Hutchinson for
I was
6 years?
Well, I was on the council for 10 years, and I had three terms as mayor. So
2-year terms?
Just 1 year terms.
Oh, they're 1 year
terms.
Okay. Were you an advocate of broadband then, or?
Well, it was a little dicier then because I was working for a broadband provider. But within the city proper, we did not have underserved areas. We had, 2 competitive cable providers. No fiber, really, except to businesses, but definitely an advocate at the county level for broadband expansion. And we worked in some areas to facilitate fiber builds and even wireless builds during the pandemic.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah,
I was on our city council for 6 years. Broadband was never the issue. Like I said, we've had fiber to the home in town for 20 years, but it was sewer and water was the big issue. So we actually just put in a new sewer facility that grows algae, and they harvest the algae and then use that for fertilizer. It's kind of neat, state of the art.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Deal, but, there's always something on the city level that's a main focus in town for sure. So
no shortage of challenges and where you can spend your money.
Yeah, for sure. So a little bit more about the Bead program. What is different about Bead than, say, the NOFA grants or some of the other funding programs that we've seen in the past? For me, as a sales guy, we see a list, XYZ, all these people are getting all this money, and we all flock to them, try to sell them stuff. But, what's the difference? What makes one program maybe better for a company than the next?
Yeah. Well, I do think that Bead has a lot more strings attached to it. It's being administered completely differently. So it's not being administered from the federal agency level down. It's going through the states with bottom-up input.
So do you like that? So that the state level gets more focus on where they want to put the money? Is that a good thing?
Well, obviously, I think it's a great thing, Tim, because
that's your
I'm
whole
at
job,
the state,
but, yeah.
you know? But I do think that, the closer government is to the people, the more they understand the problems on a more granular level and are better equipped to solve them with input from the people they affect, right? And so I love that it's being done at the state level, and I also like that it's requiring stakeholder engagement at the local level. So there's a lot of outreach and planning, local planning done, and engagement on the survey side to really understand the lived experiences of people in the digital divide in Kansas, and also from the provider side, understand the challenges they're going through to getting broadband into these spaces that have been historically disconnected for ages, right? So I think it's a good model, but it's almost like they've taken everything that's gone wrong with former programs and tried to build in some kind of safeguard. And now that has led to a lot of strings to these grants that haven't been in prior programs, and might make it a little more challenging for resource-strapped
What would be an example of said string?
Well, the Build America, Buy America. Usually those requirements are waived for most government grant programs, and there are certain components that will be waived. In fact, that waiver just came out last Friday, I believe.
Yeah, I saw that.
But there are also a great deal of components, the ONTs, the OLTs, the fiber that must be sourced from here in America, which I think overall is great that we are forcing the issue of onshoring.
I think if we learned anything through COVID, it was the supply chain.
Yeah,
it's been a global supply chain, and we can't always count on that. So we need to bring some of that back home.
And so I'm happy to see that, but we haven't yet received guidance on how to really monitor that, how to verify it, and so providers are a little skittish on the amount of bureaucracy that may be involved with that.
Sure.
That's just one component. The letter of credit was something that I know smaller providers were concerned about. There have been some loosening of those restrictions, but still a program geared to those with access to most equity, right? Even though it's supposed to be a program that really allowed for the entry of non-traditional providers, such as co-ops and nonprofits and muni broadband, right? Smaller, minority-owned, lots of different players were supposed to have equal access to the funding, and I think there's still those efforts to ensure that they do. But looking at the totality of the requirements, it's a lot.
Within the different states, how do you work together with, say, Missouri, Nebraska, Iowa? All the different states. I assume you collaborate some. Yeah. But I suppose there's a little bit of independence as well. Tell me a little bit about the different relationships with the states.
Well, I have got to tell you, the group of state broadband directors nationwide is so wonderful and pretty tight. So we have this group called State Broadband Leaders Network that was facilitated by the NTIA years ago, back during, I think, like the ARA days of State Broadband Initiative during, the Obama Reinvestment Act.
Okay.
So there were some state broadband leaders out of that. Never any money toward broadband, but states were given a little bit of funding for, some mapping and maybe one person in, the state to kind of head up some broadband efforts. And so the State Broadband Leaders Network came out of that, and the NTIA still keeps this group going. We have every other week meetings, Zoom meetings. We meet twice a year in person. We just met in February in Philadelphia, and share best practices. And then we have a Google group where we share best practices all the time. Okay. I mean, I'm texting constantly with other state broadband leaders, and I think there's this idea that there's all this competition. NTIA has this dashboard, and this state's here and this state's there, but you got to remember, every state has a different strategy for when they want to go into the subgrant process and when they want to get BEAD dollars out the door. And so it's not necessarily indicative of which state is doing a better job. Every time I talk to another state, there's so many things that I think they're doing really great that I'd like to steal, right?
Yeah.
And they think the same way. So it's a lot of back and forth. We can't take all the great ideas and produce them all because we just never move forward. I like to make decisions quickly and, keep the ball rolling. But yeah, work really closely with a lot of state broadband directors.
Yeah. Well, not to put you on the spot, but I know the big question, what everybody wants to know is when will the money hit the streets?
Well, that is a wonderful question, Mallory. Well, Kansas's strategy is to move as quickly as possible. So we have had our Volume 2 into the NTIA for several months and are just waiting approval on that before we begin next steps toward the subgrant process. We've already gone through our challenge process and we're submitting those results. NTIA has to review your process and sign off before you can move to the subgrant process, which is what everybody cares about, right?
Yeah. The subgrant is where you're breaking it down to the individual awardee.
Well, it's basically where you release, this is what the application is going to look like, and you allow people to then come in and apply.
Okay, to then apply.
Yeah, but between Volume 1 and Volume 2 and subgrant is, there's a lot of other steps.
Yeah.
That's also a misconception. Okay, states need to do 5-year action plan, Volume 1, Volume 2, challenge, and then they're off. But for states that are designating project funding areas like Kansas, we'll have to do that high-level design and get those areas out for people to view. We've committed to publishing those at least 2 weeks before we start the subgrant process. We have to build a grants application portal. And there's a lot of just always constant back and forth with NTIA in between each of these steps, and lots of approval, volumes of paperwork. So right now, because Kansas is one of the ones that has chosen to move really quickly, NTIA is kind of moving along with us. And so there's not necessarily processes in place for them to, like yesterday was the day we got the process for submitting our challenge results, right?
Yeah.
And so Louisiana, Virginia, and Kansas have all done their challenge, right? And so we're just kind of waiting, how do we submit these? And so they're working as quickly as they can, and then we're waiting. And as soon as they're ready to go, we're ready for the next step. So really trying to stay one step ahead of the process. We hope to get our subgrant process open in June. If all goes well, hopefully we'll have our project funding areas out end of March, or even it might be April. So we want people to be able to look at these areas and have an idea of if they're interested in applying and start the design, design conversations. Yeah. I mean, we already published that we were going to look at school districts as a starting point, so people could start thinking about where they want to edge out their networks. But obviously, that's not going to work in every school district. We have 286 school districts in Kansas, and some of those will be combined. Yeah. Some of those will be split apart. Some of those will include components of, maybe a few locations in another district. We really want to have an eye to where is existing plant, and how can we design a project funding area that's going to induce interest in bidding on it? Because none of this works if you just throw out an arbitrary area.
Well, that was one thing I was wondering too. It's if nobody takes the bait, if you will.
Yeah.
Could it be that companies are forced to build?
I don't think so. But we have enough flexibility built into a second or third round.
It might just be that later it's going to cost more to build it because that's why we're not there in the first place.
And I think that if NTIA, say a state gets to the last round of funding and there are areas no one wants anything to do with, I think NTIA is going to be amenable to, applications for waiver of the 25% match. Because one thing we're really hearing is, this can't be done for 75% public funding. Some of these networks, even if you 100% subsidized the CapEx, they're still worried about the long-term operational
Maintaining it,
costs, right?
Yeah.
And so I think those are hard conversations we're going to have at the last few percent of those locations. But who knows? I mean, it's all guesswork until we get the sub-grant process out and we see what the interest is on the bidding side.
Yeah. Well, we'll see what comes of it.
Yeah.
When I look at Kansas in particular, one thing I notice is not a lot of activity with utility companies, RECs, in the broadband space. Is there a reason behind that, or?
I would love to hear your thoughts on that, Tim. It's interesting because if you look at, say, Arkansas, they're very engaged. They built out an entire
Missouri,
middle mile network.
Missouri, Oklahoma, both are very active.
We have one rural electric that is really in the broadband space, and that's Butler, but really just hasn't caught on in Kansas. I think that they want to really stick with their core mission. But, there are so many efficiencies if you already own the poles.
Absolutely.
But it's also a completely different industry, and it's not like anybody can spin up an ISP.
Some of that I think is just education. If you're haven't been doing it forever and it's brand new, you're going to have your reservations. We deal with that it really doesn't matter who. It could be a contractor, it could be a utility, but we've done it this way for the last 30 years and we're going to keep doing it this way. So sometimes the change is difficult, but.
Yeah. And there's risk involved. And so it really just depends on how much the members push it. We do also just have a lot of strong RLECs in Kansas. And so they're already taking care of a lot of these rural spaces. Even though we have, I would say maybe 87,000 Bead eligible locations, that's a lot lower percentage than in some states. You look at Missouri, they have, a couple 100,000 and many of them in the Ozarks. So it's going to be hard
because it's all rock.
Yeah.
Real quick, I wanted to touch on this. So you were announced last year, 2023 Woman of the Year for Kansas for USA Today.
Where did you dig that out?
I can't divulge my resources, but no, I thought that was great. I read that article, and tell me a little bit about what that meant to you.
Yeah, well, I got this phone call, and it was an editor of a paper, and they said, well, I'm calling to tell you have been selected as the 2023 Kansas Woman of the Year by USA Today. And I'm like, really? Like, why? I mean, not that I'm a terrible person, but I think my comment was, I could name a dozen women in this building alone that are more deserving of this honor. So it was certainly just a mind-blowingly enormous honor for me.
Well, I looked through the list, across the country. I mean, there's some
stellar
some very
women.
Big names there that you're incorporated with. So I thought that was great. I had one quote I wanted you to touch on. I'm gonna read it just to make sure I get it right. But so I read in the article, you said that you put everyone on the same level and that you can learn from anyone in the room. It's not about proving your point, but standing up for what's right, even if it's unpopular. When did you come to that realization, and how's that affected you?
Oh, goodness. I mean, I think I've always benefited from the generosity of people's knowledge and just been really attuned to the fact that I'm never the smartest one in the room. And so that's, I think, a real gift because I can, I can always learn from people. But knowing that has made me, I guess, endeavor to help others recognize that too. And one way that really came to fruition was when I was on council, and we had 10 different city level commissions, a commission for everything, right? Planning commission, housing commission, historical commission. And it was like the same people and the same type of person were always appointed to these commissions, right? And I knew that wasn't in the best interests of our city because you're only hearing from a tiny, tiny percentage of people in the community and usually people with the same experiences. And so really pushed for a complete change in the policy of appointments. In fact, the last time I was mayor, I just paused all appointments. Said I'm not appointing
Yeah.
anybody to any commission
That
until
was certainly probably unpopular.
It was unpopular, but I tried to pitch it in a way that like we've done it this way for a long time, and we're just not bringing new voices to the table. So I guess that would be one example. But I do think that particular instance, maybe it wasn't popular at the moment, but now it's really popular because we have younger people now on those commissions. We have people representing groups that were completely left out of the conversation before. And it's really come in handy in this job because my background is very fiber heavy. And I come into this role, I know nothing about satellite broadband. I know nothing about the spectrum, wireless. You have to have a level of humility and learn from every provider, learn about, what everybody's offering. And then on the digital equity side, just going into communities and understanding the lived experiences of people with, say, disabilities or people in aging populations who are completely intimidated by use of the internet.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if you go in there with this kind of I know what you need mentality, you're not going to get anywhere, and you're also not going to learn anything. You're not going to be a very effective policymaker. And so I think it's come in handy. But you really pulled that one out of nowhere and didn't let me know you were going to ask that.
We try to do our research. No, that was great.
Darn you, Google.
Darn you, Google. No, Jade, it was an absolute pleasure to meet you today. Thank you so much for joining us. The people of Kansas are lucky to have you, and I know you're doing great things there. So thanks again for joining us.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
You bet. Thank you.
Okay.
Wow. What a great conversation we had with Jade today. I really appreciate her coming in and spending some time with us. Such a wealth of knowledge when it comes to broadband and funding, et cetera. I'm sure you all enjoyed that as much as I did. Always remember, if you're looking for great representations from a wonderful sales force here in the Midwest, look us up here at cbmrep.com. Or, if you've got an issue with the project and you're looking for a solution, reach out to our folks here. We're happy to help. Like I said, always go back and give us a thumbs up, like, share, comment. We'd like to hear from you and see what kind of stuff we can offer you here on the podcast. Until next time, thanks for joining us on Power the Network.